There's a story about four brothers who left home for college and became wealthy lawyers and doctors. And these four brothers got back together years later and over dinner discussed what each of them would be getting their elderly mother for her birthday as it approached. The first one said, "I had a big house built for Mama." The second one said, "Oh yeah? Well, I had a $100,000 theater put in that house." The next one said, "Well, I had the dealership deliver a brand new Mercedes to Mama's house." The fourth said, "You know, Mama really loved reading the Bible, but her eyesight's gone, so she can't really read it anymore. Well, I met this preacher who told me about a parrot that can recite the entire Bible. It took 20 preachers and 12 years to teach him, and the church had me pledge $100,000 a year for 20 years, but it was worth it. Mama just has to name the chapter and the verse, and that parrot will recite it." The other brothers were pretty impressed by this. Shortly afterwards, the mother sent out her thank you notes. To the first she wrote, "Milton, the house you built is so huge. I live in only one room, but I have to clean the whole house. Thanks anyway." To the next she wrote, "Michael, you gave me an expensive theater with surround sound. It could hold 50 people, but most of my friends are dead, I've lost my hearing, and I'm nearly blind. I'll never use it. Thank you for the gesture just the same." To the third she wrote, "Marvin, I'm too old to travel. I stay home and I have my groceries delivered. I never drive that Mercedes, but I appreciate the gesture. Thank you." To the fourth one she wrote, "Dearest Melvin, you were the only son who put some real thought into your gift. That chicken was delicious." Even though this is only a joke, and a painful one at that, countless people in real life fail to see the value in what they've been given. There's a story of a man who found an old violin in the trash, and upon getting it appraised, was told it was made by one of Italy's most famous violin makers, and had a value of about $50,000. True story. There's a family in Louisiana who sold an old painting that had been lying in their basement for about $2, only to discover it was actually a Picasso worth hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars. Or the owner of an antique shop in California who sold an old painting for $2 and later learned it was the second confirmed picture of the outlaw Billy the Kid, worth up to $5 million. Let's not forget the Australian company called Guns, who made a ton of money in the timber industry, but didn't pay attention to the priceless rainforests and animals and clean air destroyed in the process. Or Chevron, who became California's biggest employer and taxpayer, but they failed to consider the 15,000 lives they sent to the hospital when a fire at their plant set toxic fumes into the air. Listening to the many ways we undervalue gifts from other people can often be funny, but it seems the humor is lost when we fail to appreciate the value of the things we've been given by God. When I first thought about discussing the environment and humanity's treatment of it, I told myself, that's a little too political, I don't know. Politics usually just tends to divide people. But then another thought popped into my head. Why is caring for God's creation an issue of politics? Why is that something we even need to debate? When people on both sides of an argument start going back and forth and throwing facts around and pointing fingers and saying who's right and who's wrong, those of us on the receiving end are left with a bunch of noise. And when dialogue becomes nothing more than noise, for me, I tend to go to the Bible. In the book of Jeremiah, the first 25 chapters are filled with prophetic visions that he's had. In Jeremiah's visions, God speaks to him about how sinful and deceitful the Israelites have become. Chapter 9 warns of what will happen to the land where the Israelites live. Take up weeping and wailing for the mountains, and a lamentation for the pastures of the wilderness, it says. Because they're laid waste so no one passes through, and the lowing of cattle is not heard. Both the birds of the air and the animals have fled and are gone. This sounds more like something out of a Mad Max or some other post-apocalyptic movie. But then the passage asks, who's wise enough to understand this? Why is the land ruined and laid waste like a wilderness so no one passes through? Well, God gives a pretty direct answer, saying, because they've forsaken my law that I set before them, and have not obeyed my voice or walked in accordance with it, but have stubbornly followed their own hearts, and have gone after the Baals, as their ancestor taught them. Baal was one of the other gods frequently mentioned in the Bible, especially when we hear about people turning from God and worshiping false idols. And I remember back when I first began to read and study the Bible, I'd always get so frustrated reading the Old Testament and how the Israelites would have all these amazing things done for them, being free from Egypt, given food and water in the desert, protected from enemies, and yet they managed to forget all this and turn their backs on God. It baffled me. But when I look at our world today, maybe we're not that different. These visions of the land becoming a desolate place where people and animals can no longer live are pretty accurate in a lot of parts of the world, even in our own country. One eye-opening fact I learned recently is that 80% of the world's original forests are gone. In the US alone, we're now down to 4% of our original forest. And in the Amazon, they're losing 20,000 trees a minute, which is the equivalent of 7 football fields worth of trees per minute. And on top of that, I read that 1/3 of the planet's natural resources have been consumed. So maybe we haven't turned from God to worship Baal, but there are plenty of other gods we worship on a daily basis. Wealth, power, convenience, technology. We've put so much of our trust and care into these things that we've forgotten everything that God has already provided us with. Back in 1988, society was actually on the verge of a huge movement to combat climate change. People were realizing that we were actually contributing to the destruction of God's creation. In fact, NASA's top scientist, James Hansen, testified before Congress and laid out all the facts for them. Now here's a trivia thing that I don't know if anybody's going to get, but does anyone know who Time Magazine's Person of the Year was in 1989?
Guess at it.
Okay.
Al Gore, but it could be wrong.
Oh, actually, I have a picture because I like visuals. It was, and they changed it to make it Planet of the Year, Planet Earth. That is the kind of consciousness that was rising up in America around this time. So how come nothing changed? Environmentalist and author Naomi Klein pointed out several other things that were happening in and around 1988. The free trade deal between the US and Canada was signed in '88, which was a historic moment in the advance of corporate globalization. And the next year, the Berlin Wall fell. What we needed to keep momentum going were regulations that made polluters pay and told them that they can't dig carbon out of the ground. The public needed the government to listen to their collective concerns and act on it. But instead, all these global events made these necessary actions into non-starters. The government wanted to be less restrictive, have less control, and place less regulations on corporations. So nothing ever changed. In the years to come, our economy grew even more dependent on fossil fuels like coal, oil, natural gas. And not only were we more dependent on them, we were using them even more than before. And despite all the signs these behaviors were making temperatures rise across the globe, a number of people were set to determine that that was a lie. But while people were denying these facts, more and more people within the scientific community studied the facts and came to the consensus that our planet was headed for a rise of 2 to 4 degrees Celsius. And while those numbers may not sound like too much, they will actually have drastic effects on the rise in sea levels, failure of crops, intensity of hurricanes as we're seeing, and far more. Even before the Paris Agreement was signed, the decision to try and keep the rise in temperature to only 2 degrees was discussed. And some countries were even outraged at this. The delegates from Africa had said that at those temperatures, the people of Africa would thrive. They said allowing something like that to happen would be genocide. And that's another major point we need to remember. It's not just the planet that's at stake, but all those living on it. Neglect of our planet is a humanitarian crisis. Now, I've heard the argument, don't worry about the planet, it survived all these years. And whether you're of that mindset or not, it's hard to deny the effects this is having on people all over the world. And it's also often those already living in poor conditions who are the biggest victims. So what should we do? What should our attitude be? Today's gospel reading from the book of Matthew gives us another shocking parable from Jesus. He tells the story of a landowner who goes into the marketplace first thing in the morning to hire workers to tend his vineyard. They agree to be paid 1 denarius for a day's work. The landowner goes back to the market at 9 and hires more workers, telling them he'll pay whatever is right, as you saw with our Sunday school students before. And so they join the others in the vineyard. The landowner does this again at noon, 3 o'clock, and 5 o'clock. That last group only working 1 hour when it's finally time to close up shop for the day. So imagine you were hired first thing in the morning for agreed upon price, and you see a bunch of other workers coming throughout the day. And when the boss goes to pay everyone, he starts with those who worked 1 hour and pays them the exact wage that you're promised. Those with an optimistic view of the world might think, well, if they just got paid that much for 1 hour, I can't wait to see what I'm going to get. And imagine how you might feel when every single worker, regardless of when they started, gets paid the exact same thing. These workers don't have an HR department, so they take it right to the boss, the head honcho. They tell him, we worked for you all day. You made those people who worked only 1 hour equal to us. To be honest, most of us probably agree with those angry workers. But the landowner points out, I paid you exactly what we agreed on. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my money? Or are you just envious because I'm generous? Jesus was really good at toying with our expectations. He uses this story to illustrate the way God shows each and every one of us the same unconditional love, no matter what our background, race, sexual identity, or social status is. If someone's worked years helping the poor and the marginalized in society, and someone else is more focused on what's happening in their own life, God still loves both equally. If someone is an outstanding citizen, maybe just made one little mistake, and someone else has committed horrible, unspeakable crimes, but both sincerely turn to God and ask forgiveness, God provides that forgiveness to both of them. And these might sound like radical ideas to us, but Jesus challenges us all to be just that, radical. And what does this radical love look like in today's world? Jesus' final words in the lesson are, the first will be last, and the last will be first. Can those who've reached positions of power, whether through hard work or other means, humble themselves before those who are less fortunate, and find a way to lend a hand, expecting nothing in return? Can those who are less fortunate put aside their envy or contempt for those in power, making fewer assumptions and trying to find more solutions for how they can work together? All of us, whether we consider ourselves the first ones in the field or the last ones to arrive, need to practice that radical love that Jesus teaches us. Author Michael Northcott recalls the events of Hurricane Katrina, saying, as with extreme climate events in other parts of the world, it wasn't the mobile or the affluent who suffered, but the poor who couldn't drive out of the city, or even lacked the resources for a long-distance bus ticket. Recently, we witnessed the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey, where chemical plants and refineries were left damaged, releasing toxic chemicals into the environment and harming the large low-income minority populations living nearby. And at the same time as Harvey, people living in India, Bangladesh, and Nepal were hit with flooding far worse than anything they usually see. At least 1,200 people have been killed in the floods, and many more are now homeless. In India alone, at least 17 million people have been affected by this. And while we're still hearing about Hurricane Irma and the destruction it caused in Florida and the surrounding areas, it's easy to overlook places farther away, like the island of Barbuda, who were the first to feel the effects of the storm. 90% of the island's buildings have been destroyed, and about 50,000 of the residents have been left homeless. 50% of the 1,500 residents have been left homeless. And in a 1-week time span, Mexico saw 2 devastating earthquakes, the last one taking the lives of at least 225 people. As of this past Wednesday, Hurricane Maria left Puerto Rico 100% without power, and more than 10,000 residents were forced to live in shelters. In all honesty, I was terrified if I waited any longer to deliver this sermon, that list of tragedies would only grow. So where do we find hope in something like this? Well, there are plenty of people willing to risk the lives of others or destroy the planet for money. There's a growing number of people ready to take a stand. And if you took a look at the latest edition of our church newsletter, the Chapel Bell, you'll see an update from our Discernment Committee. They've gone over numerous findings from our focus groups and discovered the core values that kept coming up within our own congregation. In relation to this sermon alone, the first line of our new vision statement jumped out at me. It reads, "Woodmont United Church of Christ embodies God's unconditional love by ministering to the needs of the people and the environment." It also talks about us striving to be advocates for peace and justice. So as I read all this, I couldn't help but feel that our congregation really was truly striving to do the very things these Bible passages had spoken about, embodying God's unconditional love, ministering to the needs of the people, and ministering to the needs of the environment. Another article you might have seen in the newsletter talked about our mission team and some of the upcoming missions that they're planning to lead us in. One of these involves gathering the ingredients needed to make emergency cleanup buckets for the hurricane victims. So that way, as families start returning home to clean up what's been left, these will help return a sense of normalcy to their lives. As our church continues to explore the various ways that God's calling us to aid in those in need and care for our planet, there are lots of things we can do right at home. Simple things like replacing old light bulbs in your house with new energy-efficient ones, turning off lights, TVs, computers when they're not in use, using renewable grocery bags instead of plastic ones, washing your clothes in warm or cold water to reduce your use of hot water and the energy used to produce it. That last change alone can save at least 500 pounds of carbon dioxide annually in most households. Some people might look at the difficult task before us and ask, how much of an impact can our church really have? Can we really make a difference in all this? So in the spirit of Jesus, I'll answer that with a modern-day parable. Perhaps you've heard it. There was an old man walking along the shore after a big storm had passed and found the vast beach littered with starfish as far as the eye could see. Off in the distance, the old man noticed a small boy approaching. And as the boy came closer, the man could see he was occasionally bending down to pick something up and toss it in the water. So finally, the man yelled out, "Good morning! May I ask what it is you're doing?" The young boy paused, looked up, and replied, "Tossing starfish in the ocean. They can't return to the sea by themselves, and when the sun gets high, they'll die, unless I put them back." The old man laughed and replied, "But there must be tens of thousands of starfish on this beach. I'm afraid you really won't be able to make much of a difference." The boy bent down, picked up yet another starfish, and tossed it into the water as far as he could. Then he turned and smiled and said, "I made a difference to that one." That's how our radical love begins. But I only call it radical because it involves something we don't see every day. A love of everyone and everything with no strings attached. A love that doesn't judge and is able to forgive all. The word radical simply means innovative or breaking from tradition. But if one person decides to practice this kind of love in their life, and if another person's inspired by them to practice that same love, eventually this becomes tradition. This becomes the norm. So when you leave here today, how will you show God's unconditional love to the world? Amen.